Most families that went into hiding were split up and did not see each other for several years. For some, loved ones were caught, never to be seen again.
But after a few weeks, they were sent to the transition camp, the Westerbork in the north.
And there they met relatives.
Other family was there. They always met up. But my parents were the first to be sent to Theresienstadt because they had an S on their papers, which is straf, punishment, because they had been found in hiding while the others had gone or were by raids or whatever. My parents of that family were really the only ones not to survive.
A lot of us were hidden, and a lot of us were betrayed, but a lot of us survived, thanks to these people. They were amazing, plain, nice people, not rich, not poor. Became one of the family. I'll always be grateful.
But you couldn't trust anybody.
But you couldn't trust anybody.
I mean, neither the Germans nor the Dutch.
So there was much animosity, and of course then right away they started and built the underground.
There was the LO, I'll spare you the Dutch word. They looked after the people that were in hiding. Onderduikers, they call them divers. They also looked after getting them ration cards. The ration cards came from the fighting resistance. Two different elements altogether. My brother was in the fighting resistance, it was LOLKP, the knokploegen. It's a Dutch word that means the fighting units. They were armed. And they would do railways, bridges, German installations, and the places where the ration cards were issued. They would take raids on them and rob the cards and then pass them on to us, to the non-fighting groups. I belong to the non-fighting groups.
Well, my brother was then in the resistance too, and my sister was in it too, my elder sister. They did all sorts of things. They would go to the jail and try to free some of the people which had been picked up by the Germans.
The underground itself worked in the south, and lots of times the people in the south didn't know the other group. There was one person maybe that is a contact, but never by name.
They printed newspapers. So, and that was of course dangerous if you brought them around.
The Dutch underground had one enormous drawback. That was the geographical situation in Holland, where everything is flat. You can't
very visible.
Where you are so visible.
We had a radio connection with England, with the Dutch government in exile in London. Radio Orange, they call that, Radio Oranje. And anyway, one of the guys was arrested. He was tortured and he broke. And that next day, 17 people in my mother's group were arrested, including my mom. I disappeared because they were looking for me too. I was 17 at the time. My brother then went and worked at the dropping fields near Spanbroek in north of Amsterdam. I joined him. Then the containers were dropped. The planes would come in at about 300-400 meters. They came in sort of flying very low, Lancasters, Halifaxes. Containers would come down. We would detach the parachutes. Now, this is a story that most people find hard to believe. The contents of the containers were put in German army trucks. The German army trucks were driven by Dutch resistance fighters in German uniforms. And that's how all the supplies got across Holland from north to south, from east to west.
When they heard about the Jews being lined up and brought to a certain camp, then they bombed the railroad, sabotaged everything that the Germans did. And of course then it came the revenge from the Germans.
The reprisals were terrible. Not just in Holland. For one German, many resistance people would die. And hostages too, not just prisoners, not just resistance prisoners, but hostage doctors, lawyers, prominent people that were just put behind bars to serve as hostages when the time would come, and they would be taken out of jail and lined up and shot.
All of a sudden, somebody disappeared. Right? They could have been shot, they could be in the concentration camp. We didn't know at that particular time.
All this stuff created more resentment and more hatred amongst the Dutch.
The universities were closed completely in 43 when the Germans asked from the students and the staff a declaration of loyalty, as it was called.
They had to sign.
They had to sign, and the students, with few exceptions, refused.
And there was what they call the Arbeidsdienst, a German word, where any young man, 18 years and up, would have to report for labor.
They were picking up men just off the street, and I can remember coming back from school one time and we saw this German truck, and they were just picking any able-bodied men off the street, and they were being transported to Germany. So we ran home, told my dad, and my dad had a little shack at the back. They built a little loft on there, and him and his neighbor, they hid up there for 3 weeks.
So my brother was shipped off to Germany, and he knew how to escape.
The stress was on the parents, because they never know if I would leave the house, they never know if you come back.
The situation seemed hopeless, but that soon changed. The Allies invaded Normandy, and they fought their way north to the Dutch frontier. On September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden was launched. British and American paratroopers dropped deep into the Netherlands in an attempt to end the war by Christmas.
And one day we looked out, and here came, all these planes came over, and I don't know how many parachutes came down, and the Germans were standing there ready with their guns and shot them out of the air, and people started crying and crying and praying out loud for nobody was going to survive from that. That was terrible.
I was just north enough not to be liberated in September 44. My sister and brother were. They were in the extreme south.
Montgomery's daring plan failed to reach a bridge too far. For many Dutch in the south, liberation had finally come. But it was obvious that the war was far from over. The Canadian Army began its historic role in the Netherlands in October 1944 with the Battle of the Scheldt.
The point and purpose of the Battle of the Scheldt was to open the Scheldt estuary so that they could use the port of Antwerp.
It's become a very essential strategic operation because the supply lines are still coming in from Normandy, and it was stretching the limits to keep the whole Allied front supplied with ammunition and food and so on.
It was the coldest winter in 40 years in all of Europe. It didn't make the going any easier.
The plan was for the Canadian 2nd Division to clear the north shore of the Scheldt estuary, while the 3rd Division would be responsible for the south shore. The 4th Armored Division would provide support. For the 3rd Division, the first mission was to cross the Leopold Canal.
We went up to the Leopold Canal, and we knew they told us that the German troops are on the other side of the canal. They set up an attack to go, and our mortars were involved. The first assault was mainly the Canadian-Scottish Reginas. There's a small bridgehead for the first few days, and the company was over Canadian-Scottish company was overrun, and one of our companies went in and put a counterattack and relieved them and regained the ground. They had a lot of good artillery, a lot of support, a lot of fire support, and we couldn't get our air support in there because it was always cloudy and rainy, and no way of getting it in.
The original attack had been across Leopold from the south, and they were having so much trouble and so many deaths.
And the tank corps and the artillery was right up to the edge of the Leopold Canal, but couldn't get across.
So they decided that we'd try and speed things up and do the attack from the north.
On buffaloes, and come in from the sea.
And the operation was called Switchback.
Our brigade, the 9th Brigade, landed on a tributary of the Scheldt estuary.
It was quite dark, and when we loaded up, and we waited a while until after dark, and then we started to move out.
And when they get into the water, they're only about 8 inches showing above the water. And we were quite afraid that if a wave came, we were going to be swimming.
We landed around just after 2 o'clock in the morning.
The heavy guns from Breskens, the coastal guns, hadn't wakened up to the fact that what was happening.
It was tough going there, getting off, because it was the tide was sort of down, and the beaches were large and wet, and you sank into it. Your boots sank into it. Everything sank into it.
Anyway, we got in the first dike, and in fact, there's a marker there now in commemoration of that. And we got to the next dike, and of course, then they had all their defenses set up.
It wasn't until later in the morning that we started to get some serious fire.
We were under quite a bit of mortar fire and shell fire. The only good thing about that was the land was so wet and damp that the shells went way down before they exploded, and all you got was mud and crap all over the place.
Yeah, they certainly laid down a lot of shelling, and we started to get casualties.
Now think about our support was coming from in front of us, because they were back at the Leopold Canal. So if you call for artillery or mortar, it was coming towards you.
Then the 9th Brigade, they were on our right, I believe. We took the left, and we were in through Biervillette.
The Germans did flood the areas with salt water, which damaged the land, I'm sure, for some years to come.
The rifle companies had the worst part of it, because they were had to use the dikes to keep out of the water, and they were just subjected to silhouettes against the skyline.
And often along the dikes, and especially at the junction of the dikes, they had dug holes, machine gun holes and so on for coverage, and so they could fire even along the sides of the dikes, which were maybe 10, 12 feet high at an angle.
I would call in artillery and use one gun to snipe machine gun posts along the dike.
There were trees along usually the top of the dike, and usually either a path or a roadway between the trees. And so you had to try and dodge from tree to tree.
Going out to Scheldt was not as easy as it seemed. There were times that we would go in on a patrol, and you were up to your waist, anywhere from your ankles to your waist in water to get across those boulders.
That's where we got our name, the water rats, conversely to the desert rats of the English division in Africa.
You'd come back soaking wet, and there were times when your clothes literally dried on you.
And the trouble is, if you did have armor, it's got to ride on top of the dikes. Well, you know, if you got a dike sitting about 30 feet in the air, and now you've got a tank riding along the top, it's like shooting ducks sort of thing, you know.
Now, of course, the artillery was our main support, and but the Typhoon bombers, at times when we were able to get them, and the conditions are right, did a fantastic job.
The Canadians faced miserable conditions during the month of fighting in the Breskens Pocket. Combat was vicious, as Hitler had ordered that the estuary be held at all costs.
Oh, they were surrounded because they couldn't go across the water because they're going into an area that's already being attacked, and they can't go anywhere else the other way. They can't go back to Belgium, it's already cleared. All that part of Holland up to Nijmegen's cleared. They were just in a pocket. But, you know, damn, they're not going to give up.